Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Lily, and I am absolutely thrilled you decided to spend your time with me today. Seriously, thank you so much for being here. Before we dive into today's episode, I just want to remind you that if you're enjoying this podcast, please hit that subscribe button. New episodes drop every week, and subscribing makes sure you never miss out on the conversations that can actually change how you communicate. Also, if you're loving what you're hearing, share this episode with someone who's learning English or someone who loves exploring language and communication. And while you're at it, check out our podcast playlist on the channel because we have compiled some absolute gems in there, episodes that are going to blow your mind. The podcast playlist is your one-stop shop for all things language learning, communication tips, and those deep dives into English that actually stick with you. You can find it linked in the description and in the pinned comment. Seriously, so much good stuff waiting for you over there. Now, let's jump into today's episode because I genuinely think this one is going to help you every single day. So here's a question I want you to sit with for just a second. If you could rewind time, if you could go back and change just one major decision in your life, just one moment where you chose differently, what would that be? Think about it. Don't answer out loud or anything. Just genuinely sit with that question. Because whatever answer popped into your head first, whatever decision you're thinking about, I guarantee it starts with the same two words that almost every single person on the planet uses when they're imagining an alternative past. Those two words? They're the foundation of everything we're talking about today. And here's the thing, almost every single person gets them wrong in English. I was reading through a language learning forum last week, and I found this person, a really thoughtful learner, and she had written out 2 sentences in a row that made me literally stop scrolling. I read them again 3 times because they almost sounded right, but something was definitely off. Something was broken inside them grammatically. The first sentence she wrote was, "I would have talked to you on the phone, but my device stopped working." The second one was, "If I would have trained more, I would have done better on my entrance exam." Both of these sound almost natural, don't they? Both of them sound like something you might hear a native speaker say in a casual conversation. But both of them have something fundamentally wrong baked into the structure. And by the end of this episode, you're going to know exactly what that wrong thing is, and you're going to understand why it's wrong, and most importantly, you're never going to make these mistakes again. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I do want to ask you one more time. If you're finding this episode helpful, please like it, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. Tell someone about it. Your support genuinely motivates me to keep creating these deep dive episodes that go beyond just grammar rules and actually help you understand how English works at its core. All right, let's get into it. So the 2 structures we're talking about today are would have and would have been. And these 2 structures show up everywhere in English. They're used constantly. But they're constantly misformed, constantly broken by learners, and honestly, even by some native speakers in casual speech. And the reason they get misused so much is because understanding them requires understanding one really specific, really important idea first. That idea is this. Both of these structures, would have and would have been, they live in an imaginary past. Not the real past, not what actually happened in your life, but an imaginary past, an alternative past, a past that did not actually occur. Think about it like this. When you use would have, you're describing a different universe, a different timeline where things went a different way. You're saying, in this imaginary version of my life, this thing happened. But in the real version, the actual version that I'm living, it didn't. Every single time you use would have or would have been, you're talking about something that never actually occurred, something that exists only in your imagination, only in your thinking about what could have been. So let me give you some examples. If I say, I would have called you yesterday, what does that tell us? It tells us that I didn't actually call you. In reality, no call happened. But in an imaginary version of yesterday, there would have been a call. If someone says, she would have been a surgeon, what does that mean? It means she is not a surgeon in real life. But in an imaginary version of her life, an alternative timeline, she would have been wearing scrubs and performing operations. Or think about this one. We would have arrived by noon if the traffic had been lighter. Did we arrive by noon? No. But in an imaginary scenario where traffic cooperated with us, we would have made it. Every single time you hear would have, every single time you use it, there's this underlying message. This thing did not happen. This is not reality. This is what didn't occur. This is the road not taken. And that's the thing that sits underneath everything we're going to talk about today. That one idea, that's the foundation. Imaginary past, something that didn't happen. Hold on to that, and the rest of this episode is going to make so much more sense. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Both would have and would have been live in that imaginary past, right? But they're not the same structure. They don't do the same thing. There's actually a really clear difference between them, and it's based on one simple question. Is it an action or is it a state of being? So, would have is used when something would have happened, an action, an event, something that would have occurred, something dynamic, something that involves movement or change or doing something. So if I say, she would have passed the exam, what's happening there? The action of passing, the action of taking a test and getting a good result. That's would have with an action verb. But then there's would have been. And would have been is used when something would have existed, when something would have been true, when a state or a condition would have been present, when an identity or a quality would have characterized someone. So if I say, she would have been a brilliant engineer, I'm not talking about an action. I'm not talking about something she would have done. I'm talking about something she would have been. An identity, a state of being, a condition of existence. Think about it this way. I would have finished my degree versus I would have been a college graduate. The first one is about the action, the event of finishing. The second one is about the resulting state. What would have been true about you? Who you would have been. Both imaginary, both describing something that didn't happen. But one is about doing something, and the other is about being something. Or, here's another pair. He would have left the party early versus he would have been bored at the party. The first is about the action, the decision to go. The second is about the emotional state he would have experienced. Both alternatives to reality, but one is action-oriented and one is state-oriented. And once you understand that difference, once you can feel the difference between would have for actions and would have been for states, everything else clicks into place. So here's the rule, and it's simple. If something would have happened, if it's an action verb, you use would have. If something would have existed, if it's a state or a condition or an identity, you use would have been. Same imaginary past, same sense of something that didn't occur, but the grammar changes based on what kind of thing you're describing. All right, so let's talk specifically about would have. The structure is actually really straightforward once you see it. It's would have plus the past participle of any action verb. That's it. That's the structure. So you take the base form of a verb, right? Call, pass, arrive, run, study, and you use the past participle form. Called, passed, arrived, ran, studied. These are the past participles, and then you put would have in front of them. I would have called. She would have passed. They would have arrived. We would have run. You would have studied. Now, this structure almost always shows up inside what's called a third conditional sentence. And this is where would have does most of its real work. In English, we have different types of conditionals. First conditional is about the real future. If you study, you will pass. Real condition, real possible result. But third conditional is about the imaginary past. It's the one that deals with if-only situations. The structure of a third conditional is if plus had plus past participle in the if clause, then would have plus past participle in the main clause. So you get sentences like, if I had studied harder, I would have passed the exam. If she had left earlier, she would have arrived on time. If they had trained more, they would have won the championship. Every single one of these sentences has two parts, a condition in the imaginary past and a result in the imaginary past. And here's something really fascinating about these sentences. There's a secret hidden inside each one. Every third conditional sentence is actually two negative facts in disguise. Let me show you what I mean. Take the sentence, if I had studied harder, I would have passed the exam. What are the two hidden facts? Hidden fact number 1, I didn't study hard. Hidden fact number 2, I didn't pass the exam. Both of those facts are negative. Both of them are hiding in the grammar. The sentence seems to be about an imaginary situation, but it's actually revealing two things that didn't happen in real life. Think about this example. If she had called me back, I would have explained everything. Hidden fact 1, she didn't call me back. Hidden fact 2, I didn't explain anything. Once you see that, once you recognize that every third conditional is actually two hidden negative facts, you can decode any sentence like this that you encounter. It becomes so clear. You see the sentence, and you automatically understand, oh, this person is describing something that didn't happen, and they're revealing two things that are true about their actual life. It's actually quite useful to recognize that pattern. Now, one more thing about third conditionals that's really important. The order of the parts is flexible. You don't have to put the if clause first. You can put it second. Both of these are correct and natural. If I had known, I would have called you. Same sentence with a different word order. I would have called you if I had known. Both are equally natural in English, but there is a small difference with punctuation. Same sentence with a different word order. I would have called you if I had known. Both are saying the same thing. Both are equally natural in English, but there is a small difference with punctuation. Okay, so let's talk about the first sentence from that forum post I mentioned. The person wrote, I would have talked to you on the phone, but my device stopped working. And the thing that's wrong with this sentence is the word of. It shouldn't be there. It's a contraction issue. Here's what's happening. In fast, natural speech, when native speakers say would've, they contract it. It becomes would've, pronounced quickly as one syllable that sounds like wove. And the problem is that wove sounds almost identical to the word of. So when learners hear native speakers speaking naturally, they hear something that sounds like would've, and that's what they write down. But here's the truth. Would've is not a word in English. It doesn't exist. Not in any context. Never. It's always wrong. Always. You never write would've. Ever. What you write is either would have in formal or careful writing, or the contraction would've in informal writing. But the word of has nothing to do with this structure. And this same issue happens with other modals too. Should've is wrong. Should've or should've. Could've is wrong. could have or could have. Might have is wrong. Might have or might have. All of them follow the same pattern. In speech, they sound like they end in of, but in writing, you never spell them that way. You spell them with have. So the correction for that first sentence is simple. I would have talked to you on the phone, but my device stopped working. The of disappears, and would have appears. That's the fix. And now that you know this, you're probably going to start noticing it everywhere. You're going to hear people saying would have, and you'll know exactly what's happening. It's a pronunciation issue that's creating a spelling error. All right. Now let's talk about the second sentence from that forum post, because this is a really important mistake. She wrote, if I would have trained more, I would have done better on my entrance exam. And the problem here is really specific. The word would appears in the wrong place. It's inside the if clause, and it should never be there. This is the trap. This is the place where so many learners get stuck, and I understand why. Because both clauses feel like they should match. The main clause has would have, so learners think, oh, the if clause probably should have something similar. Let me put would have there too. But that's not how English works. English doesn't work that way. Here's the rule, and it's absolute. Would have never goes inside an if clause. Never. Not once, not in any third conditional sentence. Never. The if clause has one job and one job only. It describes the imaginary condition using had plus past participle. That's it. Simple, clean. And then would have appears only in the main clause, describing the imaginary result. So the correction for that sentence is, if I had trained more, I would have done better on my entrance exam. Notice the change. In the if clause, it's now, if I had trained. Just had plus the past participle. The would is gone. And then in the main clause, I would have done better. That's where would have lives. The two parts have completely different structures. If clause, had plus past participle. Main clause, would have plus past participle. They never swap. They never match. They're different on purpose because they're describing different things. The if clause is looking further back into the past, describing the imaginary condition. The main clause is describing the imaginary result that follows from that condition. Let me give you a few more examples so you can really feel the difference. If I would have known about the job opening, I would have applied immediately. That's wrong. The correction? If I had known about the job opening, I would have applied immediately. The would moves from the if clause to the main clause where it belongs. Here's another. If she would have studied harder, she would have gotten into that university. Wrong. Correction. If she had studied harder, she would have gotten into that university. One more. If they would have left earlier, they would have made their flight. Wrong. Correction. If they had left earlier, they would have made their flight. Every time, the pattern is the same. If becomes if I had, if she had, if they had. The would disappears from the condition, and then in the main clause, would have appears right where it's supposed to be. Now, why do so many people make this mistake? I think it's because in casual, fast American English, something interesting happens with pronunciation. If I had can contract to if I'd, and I'd can sound like either I had or I would, depending on context. Now, why do so many people make this mistake? I think it's because in casual, fast American English, something interesting happens with pronunciation. If I had can contract to if I'd, and I'd can sound like I had or I would, depending on context. If you hear I'd at the beginning of a sentence, in the if clause, it always means I had. Always. If I'd known, I would have helped you. The first I'd means I had. If you hear I'd at the beginning of a sentence, in the if clause, it always means I had. Always. If I'd known, I would have helped you. The first I'd means I had. And here's an honest note. In casual American English, in very informal speech, if I would have is actually extremely common. Even educated native speakers say it, so learners hear it constantly. They hear native speakers using it, and they think, oh, so it must be okay. But here's the thing. Every major grammar authority, every style guide, every formal writing standard considers if I would have non-standard. It's considered incorrect in formal writing. So in an essay, in a job application, in anything professional, you need to use if I had. Always. Not sometimes. Always. All right. Now let's talk about would have been. This is a totally different structure with different uses, and it can get a little complicated, but I promise I'll break it down in a way that makes sense. Would have been uses the same would have that we just talked about, but instead of adding a regular past participle, you're adding the word been, which is the past participle of the verb to be. So the structure is would have been, and then what comes after that determines what the sentence means. What comes after would have been is the key to understanding which use we're looking at. And there are actually 3 different uses of would have been, and they can look identical on the surface, but they mean completely different things. Let's start with the first use, which I call layer 1. This is would have been plus an adjective, or would have been plus a noun. And in layer 1, we're talking about a state that would have existed, an identity that would have existed, a quality that would have been true about someone or something. So if I say, she would have been happier, I'm not talking about an action. I'm not talking about something she would have done. I'm talking about an emotional state she would have been in, the state of being happy. He would have been exhausted if he had worked all night, is describing a state of exhaustion that would have characterized him. I would have been so nervous waiting for the results, is describing the emotional state I would have experienced. And then would have been plus a noun. So I would have been a doctor is talking about an identity, a profession, a role that would have been true about me. She would have been an excellent teacher is describing the identity and quality of being an excellent teacher. He would have been the perfect fit for that job is describing a role he would have held, an identity he would have taken on. All of these are in the imaginary past. All of these describe something that would have existed but didn't. They're not about actions. They're not about things that would have happened. All of these are in the imaginary past. All of these describe something that would have existed but didn't. They're not about actions. They're not about things that would have happened. Think about how different these sentences are. She would have graduated last year versus she would have been a college graduate last year. The first one is about the action of graduating, the event that would have occurred. The second one is about the resulting state, what would have been true about her identity. Both imaginary, both about things that didn't happen, but one is about doing something and one is about being something. Or here's another comparison. I would have moved to another country versus I would have been living in another country. The first is about the action of relocating. The second is about the state of having a home in another country. Both describe an imaginary alternative, but the structure is different. And with this layer 1 use of would have been, you'll often find it used in really moving, really emotional contexts. People use would have been to imagine what someone's life could have looked like. He would have been so proud of you is imagining the state of pride he would have been in. She would have been an amazing mother is imagining the identity she would have taken on. You would have been incredible at that sport is imagining the identity and role you would have been. These sentences carry the weight of lives unlived, of choices not made, of paths not taken. And that's the power of would have been layer 1. It's not just grammar. It's a way of processing the alternative versions of our lives, the selves we might have become, the states we might have been in. Pretty deep for a grammar lesson, right? But that's the thing about these structures. They're not just about grammar. They're about how we imagine and process possibility and regret and alternative futures. Okay, so layer 2 of would have been is when it's used in the passive voice. And this is where things get interesting because the structure looks the same on the surface, but the meaning is completely different from layer 1. In a normal sentence, the subject does the action. She promoted him. She is doing the action. But in passive voice, the subject receives the action. He was promoted. Something happened to him. The action happened to the subject rather than the subject doing the action. And in an imaginary past, in a third conditional, the passive voice looks like would have been plus a past participle. So the subject would have received an action, but they didn't. The action would have been done to them, but it wasn't. Let me give you some examples. The project would have been completed on time if we had started earlier. Completed is a past participle. The project would have had the action of completing happen to it. She would have been promoted if she had stayed with the company. The action of promoting would have happened to her. The meeting would have been canceled if we had more warning. The action of canceling would have been performed on the meeting. In each of these sentences, the subject isn't doing the action. The subject is receiving the action. The work would have been done to the project. The promotion would have been given to her. The cancellation would have been done to the meeting. And all of these are in the imaginary past. These actions would have occurred, but they didn't. And here's how you recognize a past participle. Usually it ends in ed. Completed, promoted, canceled, promoted, abandoned, organized. Or it's an irregular past participle like given, chosen, sent, told, made. Once you see would have been plus one of these past participles, you know you're looking at layer 2 passive voice. All right, layer 3 of would have been is the continuous form. This is would have been plus a verb ending in ing. And this is used to describe an action that would have been in progress, ongoing, at a specific moment in the imaginary past. Not an action that would have been completed, but an action that would have been happening, still in progress, unfinished at that moment. So if I say, she would have been waiting for hours by the time we arrived, I'm not talking about a finished action. I'm not saying she would have waited and then finished waiting. I'm saying she would have been in the middle of waiting, actively waiting for hours. Waiting is an ongoing process. Or think about this one. He would have been sitting in that chair the entire time if you had told him to wait. He would have been in the middle of sitting. Actively sitting. In progress. Not finished. They would have been living in Paris by now if the job had worked out. They would have been in the middle of a life in Paris, an ongoing situation, unfinished, still happening. And the continuous adds the sense of duration, something that's happening over a period of time, something that's still in progress at the moment you're imagining. She would have been working on that project for 3 years by now. 3 years of ongoing work, still happening, still in progress, not a finished project. but work in progress in an imaginary situation. Contrast this with layer 2. She would have been given the award is passive. The award would have been handed to her. Action done to her. She would have been giving the award is continuous. She would have been in the process of handing out an award, actively doing it, still in progress. Or think about the report would have been finished versus she would have been finishing the report. The first is passive. The report would have been completed. Action done to the report. The second is continuous. She would have been in the middle of completing it, still working on it, not done yet. All right, here's the most useful thing you need to know about would have been. There's a diagnostic rule that tells you which layer you're looking at. Just one question. What is the word that comes immediately after would have been? 3 possible answers, 3 different meanings. If the word after would have been is an adjective or a noun, you're looking at layer 1, state or identity. She would have been happy. Happy is an adjective. He would have been a doctor. Doctor is a noun. Layer 1, something that would have been true about them. If the word after would have been is a past participle, ending in ed or in a regular form like given or chosen, you're looking at layer 2, passive voice. Something would have been done to the subject. She would have been promoted. Promoted is a past participle. The meeting would have been rescheduled. Rescheduled is a past participle. Layer 2. If the word after would have been is a verb ending in ing, you're looking at layer 3, continuous, an action that would have been in progress. She would have been waiting. Waiting ends in ing. They would have been living in Paris. Living ends in ing. Layer 3, an ongoing action. 1 question, 3 answers. The word immediately after would have been tells you everything you need to know, every single time. And once you know that, you can understand any sentence with would have been that you encounter. Let me show you how this works with a few examples. She would have been happy. Happy, adjective, layer 1, a state. She would have been hired. Hired, past participle, layer 2, passive, action done to her. She would have been training. Training, ing form, layer 3, continuous action. Or try these. I would have been nervous. Nervous, adjective, layer 1, state. I would have been chosen. Chosen, past participle, layer 2, passive, action to me. I would have been working. Working, ing form, layer 3, continuous action. This is the diagnostic rule. Remember it, and you can analyze any would have been sentence in the world. All right. Now here's a distinction that catches even advanced learners. It's the difference between would have been and would be. And people often confuse these two because they feel similar, but they're not the same at all. The difference comes down to time. Here's the question you need to ask yourself. Is the result happening right now, at this present moment, or did it happen in the past? Let me show you what I mean with examples. If I had studied medicine, I would be a doctor now. Right now, present time, present result. So you don't use would have, you use would be. No have, just would be. Compare that to, if I had studied medicine, I would have become a doctor by age 25. Past result, specific moment in the past. So you use would have become. The have is there because the result is in the past. Or think about this pair. If she had taken that job, she would be living in London today. Today, present, would be, no have. If she had taken that job, she would have moved to London 5 years ago. 5 years ago, Past, would have. The have is there. So the time word is the signal. If you see words like now, today, right now, at this moment, currently, any of these words that signal present time, then you don't use would have. You use would be, no have. And if the result is clearly in the past, or if there's no time word and the context makes it clear the result is in the past, then you use would have. The time word tells you everything. And here's a really common mistake. People say things like, if I had saved my money, I would have been rich now. Now is there, present time, but they used would have been. That's wrong. The now pulls the result into the present, so it should be, if I had saved my money, I would be rich now. Just would be, no have. Think about how the meaning changes. I would be rich now means you're imagining a present state. Right now, you'd be wealthy at this moment. I would have been rich by age 30 means you're imagining a past state. At some point in your past, you would have been wealthy. It's subtle, but it's important. And the time word is your guide. See now or today, use would be, no have. See a past time reference or no time word at all with a clear past context, use would have. All right, so would have and would have been don't travel alone. There are some other structures that almost always show up alongside them in real conversation, and every learner needs to understand these because they're used constantly and they work together. First, let's talk about the negative, wouldn't have. This is simply would not have, contracted to wouldn't have. And it's used to describe what would not have happened in a different past, what would have been avoided, what wouldn't have occurred. And one of the most powerful uses of wouldn't have is reassurance. When someone is worried about how something might have turned out, you can use wouldn't have to tell them the feared outcome never would have happened. So if someone says, I'm so glad I didn't tell him about the accident, he would have been so angry. You might respond, no, he wouldn't have been angry. He would have understood. You're reassuring them that the feared emotional response wouldn't have happened. Or someone might say, I'm worried that if I had quit my job, I would have regretted it. And you could say, you wouldn't have regretted it. You would have been so much happier. You're using wouldn't have to counteract the worry, to give them reassurance about the imaginary past. Another use of wouldn't have is expressing surprise at someone's behavior. I wouldn't have said that in a million years means you're surprised someone said that. You would never say it yourself. She wouldn't have been so critical of him means that response surprises you. It's out of character for her. They wouldn't have just accepted it without asking questions means you're surprised they didn't push back. And one of the most comforting things you can say to someone going through regret or guilt is, I wouldn't have done it any differently, or you wouldn't have made a different choice. You're using wouldn't have to provide comfort, to tell them their decision, their action wouldn't have been different even with more information. Now let's talk about should have. And should have almost always travels with would have in real conversation. They're a team. They work together. Should have names the right choice, the thing that should have been done. And would have names the imaginary result, the consequence. What would have happened if that right choice had been made? So you get sentences like, you should have applied for the job. You would have gotten it. Should have applied is the right choice. Would have gotten it is the imaginary result if you'd made that choice. She should have left earlier. She would have arrived on time. Right choice, then imaginary result. Or, I should have listened to my parents. I would have avoided so many mistakes. Right choice first, then consequence. He should have taken the opportunity. He would have made a fortune. Right choice, imaginary financial result. And should have, paired with would have, is one of the most natural, most frequent patterns in English. When someone is reflecting on a decision, when they're thinking about what they should have done, would have is right there, telling you what the imaginary result would have been. Now, could have is similar to should have, but slightly different. Could have describes what was possible in the imaginary past, what could have happened, what was within the realm of possibility. If you had studied, you could have passed. You had the ability. It was possible. She could have become a professional athlete if she had trained seriously. It was possible, within her potential. And might have is even more tentative. Might have suggests possibility, something that possibly could have happened. If he had been in the room, he might have noticed what was happening. Maybe he would have, maybe not. Less certain than would have or could have. All of these wouldn't have, should have, could have, might have, they all work with the same imaginary past framework. They all describe things that didn't happen, but they carry slightly different shades of meaning. Would have is pretty definite. Could have is about possibility and ability. Might have is about possibility that's less certain. Should have is about what was the right choice. Now, there's one more structure that's absolutely central to this topic, and that's I wish, because so much of the time when we're using would have, we're expressing regret. We're thinking about what didn't happen, and there's sadness or longing in that thought. And I wish is the most direct way to express that regret about the past. The structure is I wish plus subject plus had plus past participle. So you get sentences like, I wish I had studied harder. What does that mean? You didn't study hard, and now you regret it. I wish we had saved more money. You didn't save, and now you wish you had. I wish she had told me the truth. She didn't tell you, and you're expressing regret about that. And the natural pairing, the most common pattern you see in conversation, is I wish in one sentence for the regret, and then would have in the next sentence for the imaginary result. I wish I had gone to that concert. I would have loved it. First sentence is the regret, the thing you didn't do. Second sentence is what the imaginary result would have been, the good time you would have had. Or, I wish she had applied for the job. She would have gotten it. Regret first, imaginary positive outcome second. I wish I had known about the opportunity. I would have invested in that company. Regret, then the imaginary financial benefit. And there's a really common error that learners make with I wish. They try to combine the structures. They say, I wish I would have gone. It sounds so natural. It feels right, but it's always wrong. After wish, you never use would have. You always use had. So the correction is, I wish I had gone. Then in the next sentence, if you want to say what the result would have been, I would have loved it. 2 sentences, 2 structures, never mixed into one. Never, I wish I would have. Always, I wish I had. And then there's if only. It has the exact same grammar as I wish, but it's stronger. It's more emotional, more longing. If only I had studied harder. If only we had left earlier. If only she had said yes. Same grammar as I wish I had, but the emotion is more intense, more wistful, more regretful. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Let me recap the 4 biggest mistakes that learners make with these structures and the exact fixes for each one. Mistake number 1, would've instead of would've. This is a pronunciation issue creating a spelling error. You hear would've, which sounds like would've, so you write would've, but would've is never correct. Never. The fix is simple. Write would have in formal writing or use the contraction would've in informal writing. Never would've. Mistake number 2. Would in the if clause. If I would have studied, I would have passed. The would in the if clause is wrong. The if clause needs only had. If I had studied, I would have passed. Remember, if clause has had, main clause has would have. They never swap. Mistake number 3. Would have been with a simple action verb. She would have been passed the exam. No, pass is an action. Would have is for actions. Would have been is for states, identities, and passive voice. The fix. She would have passed the exam. Just would have with an action verb. Would have been is only for she would have been happy or she would have been promoted. Mistake number 4. Would have when you mean present time. If I had saved my money, I would have been rich now. The now signals present time, so don't use would have. Would be. The fix. If I had saved my money, I would be rich now. See a present time word? Use would be without the have. 4 mistakes, 4 fixes. And if you remember these 4 corrections, you're going to avoid the most common errors that learners make. All right, so here's a quick system you can use to check yourself. 3 questions that solve almost everything. Use this whenever you're unsure. Question 1. Is it something that would have happened? Is it an action? Use would have plus past participle. I would have called. She would have passed. They would have arrived. Question 2. Is it something that would have been true? Is it a state, an identity, a quality that would have existed? Use would have been. And then check what comes next. Adjective or noun, layer 1. Past participle, layer 2. Verb ending in ing, layer 3. Question 3. Is there a present time word like now or today in the result clause? If yes, use would be without the have. If no, or if the time is clearly past, use would have or would have been. 3 questions. Memorize them. Use them. They'll solve almost every situation where you're unsure about these structures. All right, let me give you a real-life example of how these structures show up in actual conversation. I'm going to imagine a scenario for you, and I want you to listen for how naturally these structures come up when people are having a real conversation. The scenario. 2 old college friends, let's call them Emma and Jake, ran into each other at a coffee shop. They haven't seen each other in 5 years. They went to the same university, and there was a specific moment back then when Jake almost transferred to a different school. It was a big decision at the time. So they're catching up, and the conversation naturally turns to that decision and what might have been. Emma says, "Jake, it's been forever. I can't believe it's been 5 years. Are you still in the same city?" Jake says, "Actually, no. I moved about 2 years ago. Started working at a tech company downtown. It's been great, but, I sometimes think back to junior year when I almost left university." "Oh, the transfer thing? Yeah, I remember you were thinking about that other school." "Yeah, that California school. If I had transferred, I think I would have had a completely different life. I would have been living on the West Coast this whole time." "That's true, but would you have been happier? I don't know." "I think so. I would have had more opportunities in tech out there, I guess. Plus, I would have been closer to my family." But then you wouldn't have met Sarah." "Right, I wouldn't have. That's the thing about these decisions. You make one choice and everything cascades from that. If I had transferred, I would have completely different relationships, a different job, probably living somewhere else." "For sure. I kind of went through something similar. I was offered that job in London. If I had taken it, I would have moved across the ocean. I would have been living completely differently. Jake says, "Did you regret not taking it?" I did at first. I wish I had at least considered it more seriously. I would have learned so much. But then I realized that if I had left, I wouldn't have pursued my current career path. So everything worked out. Yeah, I think that's the thing we don't realize when we're young. Every decision closes some doors and opens others. If I had transferred, I would have been happy in that life too, probably. Just a different happy. Exactly. You would have been a completely different person, probably. Different friends, different experiences, different everything. Jake says, "Should I have transferred? I don't know. At the time, I thought about it every single day. I wish I had made that decision faster instead of agonizing over it for months." But you made your choice, and look at you now. You're doing great. You wouldn't have changed things anyway, right? No, I wouldn't have. Not now. I'm happy with how things turned out. That's all that matters. You know, we could drive ourselves crazy thinking about all the roads not taken, all the what ifs. But if you had made a different choice, you would have been somebody else. And I like you being you. That's sweet. Yeah, I guess you're right. Coulda, woulda, shoulda, right? Exactly. Coulda, woulda, shoulda. All right, so did you notice how naturally these structures showed up in that conversation? Let me pull out some of the key sentences and show you what's happening grammatically. If I had transferred, I think I would have had a completely different life. Third conditional. If I had transferred is the imaginary condition. I would have had a completely different life is the imaginary result. I would have been living on the West Coast this whole time. Layer 3, continuous. Would have been living describes an ongoing situation that would have been happening. But would you have been happier? Would have been plus the adjective happier, a state that would have existed. But would you have been happier? Layer 1, would have been plus the adjective happier, a state that would have existed. If I had taken it, I would have moved across the ocean. Simple would have with an action verb, moving, an action that would have happened. I wish I had at least considered it more seriously. I wish plus past perfect, the regret structure. Then the result in the next sentence. I would have learned so much. Would have with an action verb. If I had left, I wouldn't have pursued my current career path. You would have been a completely different person. Would have been plus the noun person, an identity that would have existed. At the time, I wish I had made that decision faster. Another I wish structure. Regret about the past, about not making a decision quickly. You wouldn't have changed things anyway. And if you had made a different choice, you would have been somebody else. Third conditional, the imaginary condition and result, and would have been with the noun somebody else, an identity. Coulda, woulda, shoulda. This is a common expression meaning stop thinking about what could have, would have, or should have happened. Accept what did happen and move forward. And that whole conversation, it doesn't feel like a grammar lesson, does it? It feels like two friends catching up. That's the goal. Once these structures become natural for you, you're not consciously thinking about them anymore. They just come out. The grammar disappears, and what's left is just human communication. Real conversation, real emotion, real reflection. You know, I think it's worth taking a moment to talk about why this matters beyond just grammar. Because these structures, would have and would have been, they're not just random grammar points. They're deeply connected to how we think about our lives and our choices. Every time we use these structures, we're engaging with a fundamental part of the human experience. Regret, wondering, the paths not taken, the decisions we made, and the decisions we didn't make, the people we became, and the people we might have become. And when you think about it, almost every major decision in your life, you probably think about it in these terms. If I had studied differently, my career would have been different. If I had taken that job, I would have been living somewhere else. If I had said yes to that person, I would have had a whole different relationship history. We're always imagining the alternative versions of ourselves. And what's fascinating is that every language has a way to express this. Every language has structures that allow you to talk about the imaginary past, about the road not taken. Because it's such a fundamental part of human experience, we're always wondering, always imagining, always thinking about how things could have been different. And in English, the way we do that is with these exact structures we've been talking about. Would have been. They're the grammatical vehicles we use to transport ourselves to an imaginary past and imagine alternative versions of our lives. So when you learn these structures properly, you're not just learning grammar, you're learning a way to express something deeply human. You're learning to articulate the contemplation and reflection and regret and wonder that all of us experience. That's why getting them right matters. That's why it's worth understanding them deeply. All right, let me just do a final super fast recap of everything we've covered today, because I know we went deep and I want to make sure you have the key points locked in. Would have and would have been both live in the imaginary past. Both describe something that didn't happen. That's the foundation. Keep that in mind. Would have plus a past participle describes an action that would have happened. I would have called. She would have passed. Would have been has 3 layers. Layer 1 is adjectives or nouns, states and identities. She would have been happy. He would have been a doctor. Layer 2 is past participles, passive voice. She would have been promoted. Layer 3 is ing forms, continuous action in progress. She would have been waiting. The diagnostic rule. The diagnostic rule, the word immediately after would have been tells you everything. Adjective or noun, layer 1. Past participle, layer 2. Verb in ing form, layer 3. Would've is always wrong. Always would have or would've. Would be for present time results. Would have for past time results. The time word is your guide. Wouldn't have for reassurance. Should have with would have for reflecting on right choices. Could have and might have for possibility. I wish plus had for regret. Never, I wish I would have. 3 questions solve almost everything. Is it an action? Use would have. Is it a state that would have existed? Use would have been. Is the result in the present right now? Use would be instead of would have. And I have a challenge for you. I want you to think about your own life. Think about a decision you made or didn't make, a direction you went or didn't go. And I want you to write about it using these structures. If you could change one major decision in your life, what would it be? And if you had made a different choice, what would have been different about you? What identity would you have taken on? What state would you have been in? Use would have and would have been. Write at least 2 or 3 sentences. Use these structures in your reflection. Really imagine that alternative version of yourself. And if you feel comfortable, share it in the comments. I read every single comment. I look at every reflection people share. And it's actually pretty moving to see how people use these structures to contemplate their own lives and their own choices. So if you want to share your reflection, please do. I'd love to hear what alternative version of yourself you find yourself imagining. All right, so that's what we're diving into next week. We're going to be looking at 3 words that almost every English learner uses every single day. And I'm telling you right now, almost everyone is choosing the wrong one at the wrong moment. The 3 words are much, many, and a lot of. And I absolutely tangled these up for way longer than I would like to admit when I was learning English. I mix them up constantly. I'd say I have much friends when I should have said many friends. I'd say much time when I should have said a lot of time. Most people struggle with these 3 words. Most people are still mixing them up. So next week, we're going to break down exactly when to use each one, when much works, when many is the right choice, and when you need a lot of. By the end of next episode, you're going to have this totally clear, and you're going to stop mixing them up forever. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. All right, thank you so much for spending this time with me today. Seriously. I know this was a deep episode. We covered a lot of ground. We went through the imaginary past, the structures, the mistakes, the real-life examples. It was a lot. But I genuinely hope that by the end of this episode, you feel clearer about how would have and would have been work. And remember, the moment these structures stop feeling like grammar and start feeling like a natural way to express your thoughts about your life and your choices, that's when you know you've truly learned them. If this episode helped you, please like it, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who's learning English, and check out our podcast playlist because there are so many more deep dives waiting for you there. Thank you again for being here. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your commitment to really understanding English, not just memorizing rules, but actually understanding how it works. I'll see you in the next episode. Take care, everyone. Bye.